Imagine this, you're rushing to the airport for the most important meeting of your life, only to realize you've forgotten your suitcase. No clothes, no laptop, no presentation materials. What do? Panic? Give up? Or find a way to adapt? That's exactly what happens to David Carter, a hardworking businessman who thinks he has everything under control, until life throws him a curveball he never saw coming. What starts as a chaotic day turns into a journey of self-discovery, unexpected humor, and powerful lessons about resilience and adaptability. But here's the question, can David pull it off without losing his mind, or his career? Stick around to find out how one small mistake leads to big transformations. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss stories like this one. They're crafted to inspire, entertain, and leave you with lessons you can apply to your own life. And we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment that forced you to adapt and grow? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your story. It was another hectic morning in the Carter household, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Chicago. The alarm clock had barely finished its first ring when David Carter shot out of bed like a rocket. At 40 years old, he was the epitome of a busy businessman, always on the go, always juggling deadlines, and always forgetting something. Today, however, was different, or so he thought. He had an important business trip ahead of him, one that could make or break his career. His wife, Sarah, 37 and as thoughtful as they come, knew better than to take his word for it. She'd been married to David long enough to know that, "I've got everything under control," usually meant, "I forgot my socks." The house buzzed with activity. David darted from room to room, throwing clothes into his suitcase, checking his phone every 5 seconds, and muttering about flight times under his breath. Meanwhile, Sarah stood calmly by the doorway of their bedroom, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with a knowing smile. "David," she called out, her voice cutting through the whirlwind of movement. "Are you sure you haven't forgotten anything?" He paused mid-stride, holding up a pair of mismatched socks triumphantly. "Of course not. I'm ready. Suitcase packed, tickets confirmed, presentation memorized. What more could I possibly need?" Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. Instead, she walked over to the suitcase lying open on the bed and began folding the crumpled shirts he'd hastily tossed inside. "Well," she said lightly, "you might want to double-check your charger. And maybe grab an extra tie, just in case." David waved her off dismissively. "Relax, Sarah. I've done this 100 times before. Trust me, I'm good." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She'd seen this movie too many times to believe the ending would change. Still, she let it slide, for now. After all, there was no point arguing with David when he was in full-on work mode. As they finally made their way downstairs, the sound of car keys jingling echoed through the hallway. David grabbed his briefcase from the kitchen counter while Sarah held the front door open. The crisp autumn air greeted them as they stepped outside, the golden leaves swirling around their feet. Their silver sedan sat parked in the driveway, gleaming under the morning sun. Once settled in the car, Sarah turned to David, her expression softening. "So, tell me again about this big meeting of yours," she prompted gently. David's face lit up at the mention of it. "Oh, it's huge," he said, adjusting the rearview mirror as he backed out of the driveway. "If I nail this presentation, we could land the Thompson account. That would mean a major promotion for me, and a nice bonus for us." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That sounds incredible. Just remember, though, it's not just about impressing them with numbers. You have to connect with them, show them why working with you is the best decision they'll ever make." David chuckled. "You sound like my coach." "Well, someone has to keep you grounded," she teased, reaching over to pat his arm. For a moment, the tension melted away, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of their conversation. But deep down, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. David, oblivious as ever, hummed along to the radio, completely confident in his preparation. Little did either of them know, the day was about to take a turn neither of them expected. The drive to O'Hare International Airport was uneventful, filled with small talk about Sarah's plans for the day and David's nervous excitement about his meeting. But as they pulled into the bustling terminal, a sinking feeling began to creep over Sarah. Something felt off. She glanced at the trunk of their sedan, then back at David, who was already halfway out of the car, fumbling with his briefcase and phone. "David," she called out, her voice tinged with concern. "Did you check the trunk? Is your suitcase in there?" He froze mid-step, his hand still gripping the car door. Slowly, he turned to look at her, his face pale. "Wait, my suitcase?" Sarah sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Oh no. Please tell me you didn't leave it at home." David scrambled to the back of the car, flinging open the trunk with more force than necessary. Empty. Completely empty. His heart sank as he stared at the barren space where his suitcase should have been. "No," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." Sarah joined him by the trunk, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "I knew it," she said, her tone sharp now. "I told you to double-check everything before we left. Did you even stop to think about what you were packing?" "I thought I had it." David protested, his voice rising slightly. "I swear I put it in here last night." "Well, apparently, you didn't," Sarah shot back, her frustration bubbling over. "How are you going to give this big presentation without your notes, your clothes, or anything else you need?" David ignored her question, frantically searching every inch of the car. He opened the back seat doors, checked under the seats, even peered into the glove compartment, all while muttering to himself about how this couldn't possibly be real life. Finally, he straightened up, defeated. Okay. Let's not panic. Maybe the taxi driver from this morning has it. I'll call him." He pulled out his phone and dialed the number, pacing anxiously as the line rang. When the driver finally answered, David practically shouted into the receiver. Hi. It's David Carter. Did you happen to see a black suitcase when you picked me up earlier?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a muffled response that neither Sarah nor David could quite hear. Whatever the answer was, it wasn't good. David's shoulders slumped as he hung up the phone. "He doesn't have it," he admitted quietly. "He dropped me off hours ago and hasn't seen any suitcase since." Sarah let out a heavy sigh, rubbing her temples. "Great. Just great. So now what? We're standing here wasting time instead of figuring out a solution." David looked at her helplessly. "What do you want me to do, Sarah? I don't exactly have a magic wand to fix this." She crossed her arms again, her expression firm but not unkind. "We have two options, and we need to decide fast. 1, we go back home, grab the suitcase, and risk missing your flight, and probably your meeting. Or 2, you board the plane without it and hope for the best." David groaned, leaning against the car for support. "Neither option sounds great. If I miss the flight, I lose the account. But if I get there without my stuff..." "You'll figure it out," Sarah interrupted firmly. "You always do. But we need to make a choice right now. The clock is ticking, David." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant hum of planes taking off in the background. David closed his eyes, trying to weigh the pros and cons of each decision. Going back meant certainty, but also failure. Continuing without the suitcase meant uncertainty, but also a chance, however slim, to salvage the situation. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at Sarah, determination creeping back into his voice. "All right. Let's keep moving forward. I'll deal with the consequences once I'm on the ground." Sarah nodded, though worry still lingered in her gaze. "All right, then. Let's get you inside." And David? Yeah. Try not to forget anything else while you're at it. Despite the tension, David managed a weak smile. No promises. With that, they headed toward the terminal, the weight of the decision pressing down on both of them. Little did they know, the challenges were only just beginning. The decision made, David and Sarah hurried through the bustling airport terminal, weaving past travelers dragging suitcases and families clustered around gate monitors. Despite the chaos surrounding them, David's mind was racing in a different direction. How on earth was he going to pull this off without his suitcase? Clothes, toiletries, presentation materials, all left behind at home. This trip, which had seemed so promising just hours ago, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. As they approached the security checkpoint, Sarah grabbed David's arm gently, pulling him aside. "All right," she said firmly, her tone shifting into problem-solving mode. "We need a plan. You can't walk into that meeting looking like you slept in your clothes or smelling like an airplane bathroom." David raised an eyebrow. "Gee, thanks for the vote of confidence." She rolled her eyes but didn't let him derail her train of thought. "Here's what we'll do. Once you land, find a store near your hotel and buy the essentials, a couple of shirts, some slacks, maybe even a blazer if you're lucky. Oh, and don't forget deodorant. That's non-negotiable." David chuckled despite himself. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" Sarah smirked. "Consider it payback for all those times I've had to clean up after you. Now focus, we're almost at security." They joined the line snaking toward the TSA checkpoint, and as they waited, David couldn't help but glance around nervously. What if someone recognized him? What if word got out that he'd shown up to such an important meeting completely unprepared? The anxiety gnawed at him, making his palms sweat. Nearby, an elderly couple sat on a bench overlooking the concourse. The man, Robert, leaned heavily on a cane, while his wife, Linda, flipped idly through a magazine. They were quiet, content simply to observe the ebb and flow of people around them. But when David muttered something about how this day couldn't possibly get worse, Robert perked up. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice warm and gravelly. "Did I hear you say something about forgetting luggage?" David turned, surprised. Yeah. My suitcase. It's still at home." Robert nodded knowingly, a twinkle in his eye. "Ah, I've been there, son. Back in '82, Linda and I flew to Paris for our anniversary. Beautiful city, but I forgot my entire bag at the hotel in London before we boarded the connecting flight." Linda laughed softly, setting down her magazine. "He spent 3 days wearing the same outfit. People probably thought he was some kind of eccentric artist." David blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "And how did that work out for you?" Robert shrugged, leaning back against the bench with a wistful smile. "Honestly? It wasn't half bad. We ended up exploring little shops we never would have noticed otherwise. Found this tiny tailor who made me a custom jacket faster than you'd believe. By the end of the trip, I didn't even miss my old clothes." Linda chimed in, her voice soft but full of wisdom. "You know, sometimes these small inconveniences turn into great memories if you change your perspective. Sure, it's frustrating now, but years from now, you might look back on this and laugh." David stared at them, momentarily speechless. Here was this couple, decades older than him, calmly recounting a story that mirrored his own predicament, and somehow, it made him feel a little less alone. Sarah nudged him gently, breaking the spell. "See? Even strangers agree, you'll survive this." David exhaled slowly, feeling a flicker of hope ignite within him. Maybe this wasn't the catastrophe he'd imagined. Maybe it was just another challenge to overcome. "Thanks," he said sincerely to Robert and Linda. "I needed to hear that." Robert waved him off dismissively. "Don't mention it. Just remember, one step at a time. And hey, if all else fails, there's always room service. With that parting advice, David and Sarah moved forward, finally reaching the front of the security line. As they handed over their boarding passes and prepared to part ways, Sarah gave David one last reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said firmly. "Call me once you land, okay? And text me pictures of whatever ridiculous outfit you end up buying." David grinned, feeling lighter than he had in hours. "Deal. Thanks, Sarah. For everything." As she watched him disappear into the crowd, Sarah shook her head fondly. He might be scatterbrained, but she knew one thing for sure: David always found a way to land on his feet. The security line moved quickly after that, and David found himself standing at gate 23, staring up at the departure board. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of relief. They were still on schedule. The flight to New York was set to leave in 30 minutes, giving him just enough time to grab a coffee and mentally prepare for what lay ahead. But then it happened. A sudden ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd gathered near the gate. David glanced up again, his heart sinking as the words, "delayed," flashed ominously beside their flight number. "No," he muttered under his breath. "Not now." Sarah, who had been texting him updates from home, called almost immediately. Her voice came through crisp and concerned over the phone. "I saw the notification. What's going on?" David sighed, running a hand down his face. "They haven't said much yet, just that there's some kind of mechanical issue. Could be an hour, could be longer. I don't know." "Well, try to stay calm," she urged. "You've already handled so much today. This is just another bump in the road." "Easy for you to say," he replied wryly. But he appreciated her optimism all the same. As the minutes ticked by, the frustration among the passengers grew palpable. Some paced back and forth, muttering complaints into their phones, others slumped into chairs, resigned to the wait. David sank into one of the uncomfortable plastic seats lining the terminal, trying to focus on anything but the mounting stress. And then, like a punch to the gut, it hit him. His laptop, the one containing his presentation slides, notes, and every single detail he needed for the meeting, wasn't with him. It was sitting snugly inside his forgotten suitcase, miles away in Chicago. "Oh no," he whispered, gripping the armrests tightly. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." He dialed Sarah again, his voice trembling this time. "Sarah, my laptop. It's in the suitcase." There was a long pause on the other end before she spoke. "Are you serious right now? Please tell me you're joking." "I wish I were," he groaned, burying his head in his hands. "What am I supposed to do? I can't give this presentation without those files." Sarah exhaled sharply, clearly thinking fast. Okay. Don't panic. Call your assistant, Melissa. She has access to most of your documents, right? Have her email everything to you ASAP. You can borrow someone else's laptop when you land, or use the hotel business center." David nodded slowly, clinging to her suggestion like a lifeline. Right. That could work. Thanks, Sarah." "You're welcome," she said, her tone softening. "Just breathe, David. One step at a time, remember?" Hanging up, David scrolled through his contacts and tapped Melissa's name. As the phone rang, he glanced around the terminal, searching for a distraction from the growing knot in his stomach. That's when he noticed Robert and Linda again. They were seated a few rows away, chatting animatedly with another traveler who'd joined them. Curiosity got the better of him, and David wandered over, unable to resist the warmth radiating from their little group. "Mind if I join you?" he asked hesitantly. Linda patted the empty seat beside her. "Of course not. Pull up a chair." Grateful for the invitation, David sat down, feeling oddly comforted by their presence. Robert leaned forward, his eyes twinkling mischievously. "So, let me guess, you've discovered another problem since we last spoke. David chuckled bitterly. You could say that. Turns out my laptop's in the suitcase too. So much for being prepared. Robert exchanged a glance with Linda, who smiled knowingly. Well, if it makes you feel any better, we once missed our connecting flight because Linda decided to buy 6 pounds of French cheese at duty-free, and refused to leave until they let her carry it on board. The group erupted into laughter, including David, who found himself chuckling despite himself. And here's the kicker, Robert continued, leaning back dramatically. We ended up stranded in Frankfurt for 2 days. No hotel reservations, no plans. But you know what? We stumbled upon this incredible jazz club tucked away in the city. Spent the whole night dancing and eating bratwurst. Best accidental adventure we ever had. Linda nodded enthusiastically. Sometimes, the best memories come from the worst situations. Trust me, David, you'll get through this. And maybe, just maybe, something good will come out of it. Their stories had a strange way of putting things into perspective. As David listened, he felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. Maybe they were right. Maybe this mess wasn't the end of the world, it was just another chapter in the story. By the time Melissa finally answered his call, David felt marginally more optimistic. Hey, Melissa. I need a huge favor. The wait dragged on, but David found himself oddly at ease in the company of Robert and Linda. Their shared laughter had lightened the oppressive weight of his predicament, even if only temporarily. As he sipped a lukewarm cup of airport coffee, another voice joined the mix, a warm, melodic one that carried just a hint of mischief. Well, well, came the amused remark, looks like we've got ourselves quite the little support group over here. David turned to see a woman approaching their cluster of chairs. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back into a loose bun and a pair of oversized glasses perched on her nose. Her outfit, a vibrant scarf draped over a tailored blazer, screamed sophistication, yet there was something undeniably approachable about her demeanor. Mind if I join you? She asked, gesturing toward the empty seat beside David. Not at all, Robert replied with a grin. The more, the merrier. Especially when delays are involved. She settled in gracefully, crossing her legs as she adjusted her scarf. I'm Margaret Thompson, she introduced herself, extending a hand first to David, then to Robert and Linda. Retired travel journalist. Seen it all, heard it all, and lived to tell the tales. David raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. Travel journalist? That sounds fascinating. Margaret chuckled, leaning forward conspiratorially. Oh, it was. But let me tell you, some of the best stories come from the disasters, not the destinations. Take my husband, for instance. Bless his heart, he once forgot to pick me up at a gas station, in the middle of nowhere. The group leaned in closer, captivated by her animated storytelling. It was back in the 70s, she began, her eyes sparkling with amusement. We were driving across Wyoming, beautiful state, by the way, but not exactly brimming with convenience stores or cell phone signals. We stopped at this tiny gas station so I could use the restroom, and he promised he'd be right outside waiting. Only, she paused dramatically, drawing out the suspense. He wasn't. Turns out he thought I said I'd catch a ride with someone else. Everyone burst into laughter, imagining the absurdity of the situation. So what did you do? David asked, genuinely curious. Margaret shrugged nonchalantly. What could I do? I hitchhiked to the next town, where I found him happily eating pie at a diner. No phone call, no note, just blissfully unaware that I was stranded 40 miles behind him. Robert guffawed, slapping his knee. Did you ever forgive him? Oh, eventually, Margaret replied with a wink. But I made sure he paid for it, in pies. For a year. The group dissolved into fresh peals of laughter, and David felt a genuine smile spread across his face for the first time in hours. There was something strangely comforting about hearing these stories of mishaps and misadventures. They reminded him that life rarely went according to plan, and that sometimes, the detours led to unexpected joys. "You know," Margaret said, turning her attention to David, "you seem like someone who's used to having everything under control. Am I right?" He hesitated, then nodded sheepishly. "Guilty as charged. Or at least, I try to be." She patted his arm gently. "Let me give you some advice, dear. Control is an illusion. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be. Look at today, you've forgotten your suitcase, your laptop, and now your flight's delayed. Sounds disastrous on paper, doesn't it? But here you are, alive and well, surrounded by people who care enough to share their own chaotic experiences with you." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He glanced around at the faces of Robert, Linda, and Margaret, each radiating kindness and resilience. Despite the mess he'd created, he realized he wasn't alone. "You're right," he admitted softly. "This whole day has been humbling, to say the least. But maybe there's a lesson in it somewhere." Margaret smiled approvingly. "That's the spirit. Now, why don't you tell us a little more about this big meeting of yours? From the sound of it, you've got quite the story brewing already." Encouraged by her interest, David launched into an explanation of his upcoming presentation, describing the stakes and the pressure he felt to succeed. To his surprise, the act of sharing his worries aloud somehow made them feel less insurmountable. As the conversation flowed naturally, the delay became less of a burden and more of an opportunity, a chance to connect, reflect, and find humor in the chaos. By the time the gate agent announced boarding, David felt lighter, both emotionally and mentally. "Thank you," he said sincerely to the trio as he gathered his belongings. "You've given me a lot to think about." Margaret waved him off with a knowing smile. "Go get Tiger. And remember, sometimes the best journeys are the ones you never planned." With renewed determination, David stepped toward the jet bridge, ready to face whatever came next. The plane hummed softly as it climbed higher into the sky, leaving behind the chaos of the airport. David settled into his window seat, gazing out at the endless expanse of clouds below. For once, he wasn't consumed by anxiety about what lay ahead. Instead, his mind drifted back to the conversations he'd had earlier, with Robert and Linda, with Margaret Thompson, and especially with Sarah. Sarah's voice came through his earphones moments later, warm and steady as always. "How's it going so far?" she asked. "Any turbulence?" "Not yet," David replied with a small laugh. "But there's plenty of turbulence in my head." She chuckled knowingly. "I figured as much. So, how are you feeling? Still stressed?" David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Honestly, I think I'm starting to see things differently. Today has been, well, a disaster, if we're being honest. But somehow, it doesn't feel like one anymore." "Oh?" Sarah prompted gently. "What changed?" He leaned back against the seat, letting his thoughts flow freely. "I guess I've spent so much time trying to control every little detail, to make sure nothing goes wrong, that I forgot how unpredictable life can be. And when things inevitably do go wrong, I panic. Like today. I forgot my suitcase, my laptop, and nearly missed my flight. On paper, it's a total mess. But meeting people like Robert, Linda, and Margaret made me realize something: they didn't let those setbacks define them. They found humor in the chaos, and they adapted." Sarah listened quietly, her tone softening. "That's true. You know, I've always admired their ability to roll with the punches. It's not that they don't get frustrated, it's just that they choose not to dwell on it. They focus on what they can do instead of what they can't." David nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "Yeah. I think that's what I've been missing. I try to plan for everything, but life doesn't work that way. No matter how hard I try, I can't control everything, and maybe I shouldn't even try. No, you shouldn't, Sarah agreed firmly. Because here's the thing, David, we can't control everything that happens to us, but we can control how we react. That's where the real power lies. Not in avoiding problems, but in facing them with grace, or at least, with a sense of humor. Her words resonated deeply, echoing the lessons he'd learned from the strangers at the gate. He thought back to Robert and Linda's infectious laughter as they recounted their misadventures, and Margaret's wise reminder that sometimes the best journeys are the ones you never planned. You're right, he said finally. I've been so focused on preventing mistakes that I forgot how to handle them when they happen. Maybe it's time I stopped stressing over things I can't change and started focusing on how I respond. Sarah smiled on the other end of the line. Exactly. Besides, look at today, you've already handled more curveballs than most people deal with in a month. Doesn't that prove you're capable of rolling with the punches? David chuckled. I guess it does. Thanks, Sarah. You always know how to put things into perspective. As they wrapped up their call, David glanced across the aisle, where Robert and Linda were seated together. Catching his eye, Linda gave him a cheerful wave, while Robert offered a thumbs up. How's it going, champ? Robert called out, his voice carrying the same warmth as before. Better now, David admitted, smiling gratefully. Thanks to both of you, and to Margaret. You've all given me a lot to think about. Linda leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. You know, life is full of uncertainties. The trick isn't to avoid them, it's to embrace them. When you stop fighting the unexpected, you open yourself up to possibilities you might never have imagined. Robert nodded in agreement. And remember this, sometimes the detours lead to the most beautiful destinations. Just keep moving forward, one step at a time. David felt a swell of gratitude as he absorbed their wisdom. These strangers, who had entered his life for only a brief moment, had managed to teach him lessons he knew would stay with him forever. As the plane soared onward, cutting through the clouds toward New York, David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in hours, he felt calm, not because everything was perfect, but because he had finally accepted that it didn't need to be. The plane touched down in New York City with a gentle thud, jolting David out of his thoughts. As the passengers disembarked, he stepped into the bustling terminal, feeling a strange mix of determination and unease. For all the clarity he'd gained during the flight, the reality of his situation hit him hard once again. He was here, in one of the most important cities in the world, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hastily borrowed laptop courtesy of Melissa. Sarah's voice chimed through his earpiece as he made his way toward baggage claim, not that he had any bags to collect. All right, where are you now? She asked brightly. Walking through JFK, David replied, trying to keep his tone light despite the knot forming in his stomach. What's next on the agenda? Well, Sarah said matter-of-factly, first things first, you need to get some essentials. Clothes, toiletries, maybe even a blazer if you can find one. There's no way you're walking into that meeting looking like you've been traveling for days. David groaned softly. You make it sound so simple. But trust me, I'm already dreading this. Hey, she countered firmly, you've handled worse today. Besides, think of it as an adventure. When's the last time you went shopping in New York City? He chuckled dryly. Never, not under these circumstances, anyway. Following Sarah's directions, David flagged down a cab and headed to a nearby department store. The sleek glass facade loomed ahead, its polished interior a stark contrast to the chaos of the airport. Stepping inside, he felt immediately out of place, surrounded by racks of perfectly pressed suits and neatly arranged accessories, while he stood there rumpled and disheveled. Okay, he muttered to himself, scanning the aisles. Let's do this. As he wandered aimlessly, unsure where to start, a cheerful voice broke through his internal monologue. Need a hand? David turned to see a young man approaching him, clad in a crisp button-down shirt and khakis. A name tag on his chest read, Mike. Yeah, actually, David admitted sheepishly. I'm kind of in a bind. Long story short, I forgot my suitcase at home, and I need something professional looking for a meeting tomorrow. Mike grinned sympathetically. Ah, the classic, forgot my bag, scenario. Don't worry, I've seen it happen before. Let me help you out. Grateful for the assistance, David followed Mike deeper into the store. They browsed through rows of shirts, slacks, and jackets, piecing together an outfit that wouldn't entirely betray his predicament. You know, Mike said casually as they searched, this reminds me of something that happened to me once. I had this big presentation at work, the kind that could make or break your career, and I spilled coffee all over my suit right before heading out. No time to go home and change, either. David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you do? Mike laughed, shaking his head at the memory. Well, I ended up borrowing clothes from a complete stranger. This guy sitting next to me on the subway looked about my size, so I explained the situation, and bless his soul, he let me raid his gym bag. Wore his spare polo and khaki straight to the office. Felt ridiculous, but hey, it worked. David stared at him, torn between disbelief and admiration. And how did the presentation go? It went great. Mike replied with a grin. Turns out, no one cared what I was wearing, they cared about what I had to say. Lesson learned, sometimes you just have to roll with it. David nodded slowly, absorbing the story. It was another reminder that appearances weren't everything, that substance mattered more than style. Still, as he held up a navy blazer and tried to imagine himself wearing it, he couldn't shake the discomfort of stepping outside his comfort zone. By the time they reached the checkout counter, David had assembled a modest wardrobe, a dress shirt, a pair of tailored slacks, a tie, and the blazer. He cringed slightly at the total cost, but Sarah's earlier advice echoed in his mind, focus on what matters. As he paid for his purchases, Mike gave him an encouraging pat on the shoulder. You'll do great, man. Just remember, confidence is half the battle. Own it, and no one will notice the rest. David smiled faintly, clutching the shopping bag tightly. Thanks, Mike. I needed to hear that. Stepping back onto the crowded streets of Manhattan, David took a deep breath, the cool evening air steadying his nerves. Despite the challenges of the day, he couldn't deny the sense of accomplishment bubbling beneath the surface. He hadn't let setbacks defeat him, he'd adapted, improvised, and kept moving forward. And for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would turn out okay. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of David's hotel room, casting long golden streaks across the neatly folded clothes he'd purchased the day before. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the borrowed navy blazer for what felt like the 100th time. The outfit wasn't perfect, it didn't fit quite as well as his tailored suits back home, but it was clean, professional, and presentable enough to get him through the meeting. Still, as he stared at his reflection, a wave of doubt washed over him. This wasn't just about the clothes. It was about everything he didn't have with him, his meticulously prepared notes, his polished presentation slides, the sense of control that usually came with being overly prepared. What if he stumbled? What if he forgot something crucial? His phone buzzed on the bedside table, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was Sarah, calling exactly when he needed her most. Good morning, she greeted him warmly. How are you holding up? David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm okay, I guess. But I can't stop thinking about all the stuff I left behind. My notes, my slides, everything I plan to rely on today is sitting in my suitcase back in Chicago. Sarah's voice softened, brimming with reassurance. Listen to me, David. You've spent months preparing for this meeting. That knowledge isn't locked inside your suitcase, it's in you. Trust yourself. You know your work better than anyone else. I know, he replied hesitantly. But what if I freeze up? What if they ask questions I don't have answers to? Then you'll answer honestly, she said firmly. People respect authenticity more than perfection. Besides, you're not just selling numbers or data, you're selling you. Your passion, your expertise, your vision. Focus on that, and you'll be fine. Her words lingered in his mind as he ended the call, tying his tie with slightly steadier hands. She was right, he had poured countless hours into this project, pouring his heart and soul into every detail. If anyone could deliver this presentation without relying on props, it was him. By the time he arrived at the sleek corporate office hosting the meeting, David's nerves were still simmering beneath the surface, but they no longer threatened to overwhelm him. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, directing him to the conference room where the Thompson executives awaited. As he stepped inside, the weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. The room was filled with sharp-eyed professionals, their expressions unreadable as they flipped through printed agendas and sipped steaming cups of coffee. David took a deep breath, reminding himself of Sarah's advice, and Mike's story about confidence being half the battle. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. I'd like to share our vision for how we can partner together to achieve something truly extraordinary." Without the crutch of his slides, David found himself speaking more conversationally, weaving personal anecdotes and insights into his pitch. He talked about challenges he'd faced, not just during this trip, but throughout his career, and how those experiences had shaped his approach to problem-solving. He highlighted the innovative solutions his team had developed, emphasizing collaboration and creativity over rigid planning. To his surprise, the audience seemed captivated. They nodded along, occasionally jotting down notes or exchanging approving glances. When the Q&A session began, David fielded their questions with ease, drawing on years of experience rather than rehearsed responses. By the time he wrapped up the presentation, a palpable sense of accomplishment filled the room. One of the executives, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, stood up, extending his hand. "Mr. Carter, that was impressive," he said with a genuine smile. "You clearly understand what we're looking for, and your passion shines through. We'll be in touch soon." David shook his hand, relief flooding through him. "Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity." As he left the building, the crisp autumn air greeted him like an old friend. For the first time in days, he felt truly free, not just from the stress of the past 24 hours, but from the burden of needing to control every single detail. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah immediately. "Hey," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "It went well. Really well." "That's amazing," she exclaimed, her pride evident even over the phone. "See? I told you, you didn't need all that extra stuff. All you needed was confidence in yourself." David smiled, glancing down at his borrowed outfit. "You're right. I think I learned something important today, not just about work, but about life. Sometimes, we lean too much on material things because they make us feel safe. But real strength comes from within." Sarah laughed softly. "Sounds like someone's been paying attention to all those wise strangers you met along the way." "Yeah," he admitted, chuckling. "They taught me a lot. And so did you." As he hung up and started walking toward the subway station, David realized something profound. This chaotic journey had changed him. He hadn't just survived the setbacks, he'd thrived in spite of them. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next, one step at a time. The sun had dipped below the Manhattan skyline, casting a warm orange glow over the city streets as David stepped into the cozy Italian restaurant where he and Sarah had agreed to meet. The scent of garlic bread and simmering tomato sauce greeted him at the door, mingling with the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses. It was the perfect setting for a celebration, one that felt earned after the whirlwind of the past 2 days. Sarah was already seated at a corner table by the window, her face lighting up as she spotted him approaching. "There he is," she called out, waving enthusiastically. David grinned, sliding into the chair across from her. Hey, you. Thanks for meeting me here. Are you kidding? Sarah replied, her tone playful but full of pride. After everything you've been through this week, I wouldn't miss this for the world. Besides, I figured we both deserved a nice meal, and maybe a glass of wine. The waiter arrived promptly, taking their orders before leaving them alone to soak in the moment. As they waited for their food, Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. So, tell me everything. How did it feel walking out of that meeting knowing you nailed it? David exhaled slowly, the weight of the day finally lifting. Honestly? It felt surreal. I walked into that room thinking I was doomed without my notes, my slides, my usual routine. But somewhere along the way, I realized none of that mattered. What mattered was believing in myself, and trusting that I knew what I was talking about. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I hoped you'd take away from all of this. You've always been so focused on preparation and control, but sometimes life throws curveballs that force you to adapt. And look at you, you adapted beautifully. He laughed softly, shaking his head in disbelief. I still can't believe it. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd forget my suitcase, lose my laptop, and still manage to pull off a major presentation, I would have said they were crazy. Well, Sarah said with a sly smile, maybe forgetting your suitcase was the best thing that could have happened to you. David raised an eyebrow, amused. Really? You're going to spin this into some kind of silver lining? Absolutely, she replied without hesitation. Think about it. Without that suitcase, you learned how to think on your feet, how to trust yourself, and how to handle uncertainty. Those are skills money can't buy, and ones that will serve you far beyond this one meeting. He paused, considering her words. She wasn't wrong. This trip had forced him to confront his fears, embrace imperfection, and find strength in vulnerability. In a strange way, losing his belongings had given him something far more valuable: perspective. You know, he admitted, his voice tinged with wonder, I never thought I could adjust so quickly. I've spent years thinking I needed every detail planned out to succeed. But now? I'm starting to see the beauty in flexibility, in rolling with the punches instead of fighting them. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand affectionately. That's growth, David. Real, meaningful growth. And honestly, I'm proud of you, not just for pulling off the presentation, but for handling everything else with such grace. Their food arrived then, steaming plates of pasta and freshly baked bread that smelled irresistible. As they dug in, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, funny moments from the trip, stories about Robert, Linda, and Margaret, and even Mike's unforgettable tale of borrowing clothes from a stranger. At one point, David leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine thoughtfully. You know, I used to think success meant having everything under control. But now I realize it's about being able to adapt when things fall apart. Life isn't about avoiding chaos, it's about learning how to thrive in it. Sarah smiled warmly, raising her glass in a toast. To thriving in chaos, then. And to embracing whatever comes next, with or without a suitcase. David chuckled, clinking his glass against hers. Cheers to that. As they continued their meal, laughter filling the air between them, David felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the success of the meeting, but for the journey that had brought him here. He had started the trip as a man who feared uncertainty, clinging desperately to plans and routines. But he was leaving it as someone stronger, wiser, and more open to life's unexpected twists. And for the first time in a long time, he couldn't wait to see what came next. The evening had been nothing short of magical: good food, great conversation, and a shared sense of accomplishment that lingered long after dessert was finished. But as David and Sarah returned to their hotel, ready to unwind from the whirlwind of the day, they were greeted by an unexpected twist. The grand lobby, usually bathed in soft golden light, was eerily dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of emergency exit signs. A small crowd of guests milled about near the front desk, exchanging murmurs of frustration and confusion. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing as she approached the concierge. The young woman behind the counter offered an apologetic smile. "We're experiencing a power outage, ma'am. It seems to be affecting the entire building. No elevators, no air conditioning, we're working to resolve it as quickly as possible." David groaned softly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Of course. Because why not? Let's add one more thing to the list of disasters this trip." Sarah shot him a teasing glance. "Come on, you've handled worse today. 10 flights of stairs won't kill you." "Speak for yourself," he muttered under his breath, though there was no real bite to his words. With no other option, they joined the trickle of guests making their way toward the stairwell. The narrow corridor echoed with the rhythmic thud of footsteps and the occasional muttered complaint from fellow travelers. David took a deep breath before starting the climb, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. "You know," he said wryly as they ascended, "this feels like another test of my patience. First the suitcase, then the laptop, now this. What's next, a pigeon flying into our room?" Sarah laughed, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. "At this point, I wouldn't put it past the universe to throw something else your way. But hey, at least we're getting some exercise." David chuckled despite himself, his pace slowing slightly as fatigue began to set in. "Exercise? Is that what we're calling this now? If so, remind me never to sign up for a marathon." By the time they reached the 8th floor, both were breathing heavily, their laughter mingling with the steady rhythm of their steps. Sarah paused briefly, leaning against the railing to catch her breath. "Almost there," she encouraged, flashing him a grin. "Just 2 more floors." "I'm holding you to that," David replied, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged onto the 10th floor, greeted by the familiar sight of their hallway. The air was warm and still, heavy with the absence of electricity, but the relief of reaching their destination outweighed any discomfort. "Well," David said, unlocking the door to their room, "at least we made it. Now let's hope the generator kicks in soon." But when they stepped inside, the oppressive heat and darkness only heightened the surreal quality of the evening. Sarah wandered over to the window, pulling back the curtains to reveal the sprawling cityscape beyond. Without the usual blaze of lights, the skyline looked softer, quieter, a stark contrast to the bustling metropolis they'd seen earlier in the day. "Hey," she called out, her voice gentle. "Come here for a second." Curious, David joined her at the window, following her gaze out into the night. The stars above twinkled faintly, visible thanks to the lack of artificial light pollution. Below, the streets shimmered with the faint glow of car headlights and scattered lampposts, painting the city in muted tones of silver and gray. "It's kind of beautiful, isn't it?" Sarah murmured, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. David nodded slowly, his earlier frustration melting away as he took in the view. "Yeah, it is. Strange how something so inconvenient can turn into something so peaceful." For a moment, neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together in the quiet darkness. The chaos of the past few days, the forgotten suitcase, the delayed flight, the impromptu shopping spree, all seemed distant now, overshadowed by the simple joy of being present with each other. "You know," David said finally, his voice soft, "if someone had told me at the start of this trip that I'd end up climbing 10 flights of stairs in the dark and actually enjoying the view, I would have thought they were crazy." Sarah smiled, turning to look at him. "That's because you've changed, David. You've learned to find beauty in the unexpected, and strength in the challenges." He met her gaze, feeling a swell of gratitude, not just for her unwavering support, but for the journey that had brought them here. In the midst of uncertainty, they had found connection, resilience, and even romance. As they stood there together, framed by the darkened silhouette of the city, David realized something profound. Life wasn't about avoiding storms, it was about learning how to dance in the rain. The return flight to Chicago was a stark contrast to the chaos of their outbound journey. This time, David sat comfortably in his seat, gazing out the window as the plane soared above cotton-like clouds. The turbulence that had once seemed so daunting now felt like a gentle rocking, almost soothing in its rhythm. His mind wandered back over the whirlwind of events, the forgotten suitcase, the delayed flight, the borrowed clothes, the rooftop view, and he couldn't help but marvel at how much he'd grown in such a short span of time. Sarah glanced over from her book, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. "Penny for your thoughts," she asked lightly, setting the novel aside. David smiled, turning to face her. "I was just thinking about everything that happened this trip. It's funny, when we left, I thought forgetting my suitcase would ruin everything. But now, I think it might have been exactly what I needed." She tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his seat, choosing his words carefully. "For years, I've relied on plans and routines to feel safe, to feel in control. But this week taught me something different. Life doesn't always go according to plan, and that's okay. What matters isn't avoiding problems, it's how you handle them when they come up. And I wouldn't have learned that without all these little disasters." Sarah nodded, her eyes soft with pride. "You've handled them beautifully, David. Honestly, I don't think I've ever seen you adapt so quickly, or grow so much, in such a short amount of time." Her words warmed him, but he knew he owed part of his transformation to the people who had helped along the way. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Robert and Linda's number. They'd exchanged numbers briefly before parting ways at the airport, promising to stay in touch. "Mind if I make a quick call?" he asked Sarah, holding up his phone. "Go ahead," she replied with an encouraging smile. The line rang twice before Robert's cheerful voice answered. Well. If it isn't our favorite scatterbrain traveler." David laughed, shaking his head. "Hey, Robert. Hey, Linda. I just wanted to say thank you, for everything. Your stories, your advice, they really helped me get through some tough moments this week." "Oh, nonsense," Linda chimed in warmly. "We were happy to help. How did the big meeting go, by the way?" "It went great," David replied, his tone brimming with gratitude. "I didn't have my slides or notes, but somehow, it worked out. I realized I didn't need all those things, I just needed to trust myself." "That's wonderful to hear," Robert said approvingly. "You see, life has a funny way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. Sometimes, the best adventures are the ones we never planned." "I couldn't agree more," David admitted. "Thanks again, you two made a bigger impact than you know." After ending the call, David turned back to Sarah, who was watching him with a knowing smile. "Feel better?" she teased gently. "Much," he replied, leaning back against the seat. "It feels good to acknowledge how far I've come." By the time they landed in Chicago, the familiar skyline greeted them like an old friend. As they drove home, David couldn't shake the sense of anticipation building within him. When they finally walked through the front door, he immediately headed for the bedroom, where his forgotten suitcase still sat untouched on the bed. Opening it, he chuckled softly at the sight of the neatly folded clothes and meticulously packed items inside. For so long, this suitcase had symbolized control, preparedness, security, but now, it felt almost unnecessary. "I don't even need this anymore," he said aloud, shaking his head in disbelief. Sarah appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a fond smile. "Not literally, maybe. But figuratively? You've carried what truly matters with you all along, your resilience, your ability to adapt, and your willingness to face challenges head-on." David turned to look at her, feeling a surge of emotion. "And you," he added softly. "None of this would have been possible without you. You kept me grounded, reminded me to breathe, and believed in me even when I doubted myself." She crossed the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What matters isn't the suitcase, or the clothes, or the plans. What matters is that we faced it all together. That's what got us through. Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating with everything he'd learned over the past week. He reached out, wrapping her in a tight embrace, grateful not just for her support but for the journey they'd shared. As they stood there, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their home, David realized something profound. Life wasn't about avoiding storms, it was about learning to dance in the rain. And with Sarah by his side, he knew he could weather anything that came their way. The next morning, David stepped into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The familiar hum of keyboards clicking and phones ringing greeted him as he made his way to his desk, but something felt different, lighter. It wasn't the environment that had changed, it was him. Gone was the man who clung tightly to plans and routines, terrified of anything going awry. In his place stood someone more adaptable, more confident, and surprisingly calm in the face of uncertainty. As he settled into his chair, scrolling through emails and reviewing the day's agenda, a soft knock sounded at his door. One of his junior employees, Emily, poked her head inside, her expression tense. "David? Do you have a moment?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," he replied warmly, gesturing for her to come in. "What's up?" Emily closed the door behind her, clutching a folder tightly to her chest. There's been a bit of a problem with the Johnson account. Their data files are corrupted, and we won't be able to pull the report they're expecting by this afternoon." For a split second, David felt the old reflex kick in, the urge to panic, to scramble for solutions, to curse the universe for yet another unexpected hurdle. But then he paused, taking a deep breath. This wasn't Chicago, this wasn't the airport, and this certainly wasn't 10 flights of stairs in the dark. This was just another challenge, one they could handle together. "No problem," he said evenly, leaning back in his chair. "We'll adapt and fix it." Emily blinked, clearly surprised by his calm demeanor. "Really? You're not upset?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Upset won't solve anything. Let's focus on what we can do instead. Have IT take a look at the files, they might still be salvageable. If not, we'll rebuild what we need from scratch. Worst case scenario, we explain the situation to Johnson and offer them a revised timeline. Transparency goes a long way." Relief washed over Emily's face as she nodded. "Okay, I can do that." "Thanks, David, I was worried you'd be furious." "Not anymore," he replied with a reassuring smile. "I've learned that every inconvenience can turn into an opportunity, if you let it. Now go ahead and get started. We've got this." As Emily left the room, David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He couldn't help but marvel at how much he'd changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, a setback like this would have sent him spiraling into stress and frustration. But now? He saw it for what it truly was, a chance to demonstrate resilience, creativity, and leadership. His thoughts drifted back to the trip, to Sarah's unwavering support, to Robert and Linda's wisdom, to Margaret's infectious optimism, and even to Mike's story about borrowing clothes from a stranger. Each of them had taught him something valuable, weaving together a tapestry of lessons that had transformed the way he approached life. By mid-morning, the team had already made significant progress on the Johnson account. IT managed to recover most of the corrupted data, and Emily worked tirelessly to reformat the remaining pieces. When David checked in with her later, she grinned proudly, holding up a printed copy of the nearly completed report. "We did it," she said triumphantly. "Thanks for keeping me calm earlier, it really helped." David smiled, feeling a swell of pride, not just in himself, but in his team. "You did great, Emily. Remember, challenges are part of the job. What matters is how we respond to them." As the day wore on, David found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. Life, and work, was unpredictable. There would always be setbacks, surprises, and moments that tested your patience. But those moments weren't obstacles to dread, they were opportunities to grow, to innovate, and to prove what you were capable of. That evening, as he packed up his things to head home, Sarah called him. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice warm and curious. "It was good," he replied, pausing to glance around the quiet office. "Different, though. I feel lighter, somehow. Like I'm seeing things more clearly." "That sounds promising," she teased gently. "Does this mean no more panicking over forgotten suitcases?" David laughed, shaking his head. "No guarantees. But I think I've learned something important, that every inconvenience can turn into an opportunity if you approach it the right way. And honestly, that's a lesson I'll carry with me forever." Sarah's tone softened, brimming with pride. "I'm so glad to hear that, David. You've come such a long way this past week, and I know you'll keep growing from here." As he hung up and stepped out into the crisp Chicago evening, David felt a profound sense of gratitude, for the journey he'd been on, for the people who had guided him, and for the newfound perspective he carried with him. Life wasn't about avoiding storms, it was about learning how to dance in the rain. And with each step forward, David knew he was becoming the best version of himself. A few weeks had passed since David's transformative trip to New York, and life had settled back into its usual rhythm. The lessons he'd learned, however, lingered like a steady pulse beneath the surface, shaping the way he approached every challenge that came his way. Now, as he stood in the hallway of their Chicago home, suitcase open on the floor before him, he couldn't help but smile at how much had changed. Sarah appeared beside him, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Another business trip already?" she asked teasingly, taking a sip. "Yep," David replied, folding a crisp dress shirt and placing it neatly inside the suitcase. "But this time, I'm not leaving anything to chance." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a mischievous grin. "Oh really? Did you check your suitcase this time?" David paused, pretending to think deeply before flashing her a confident smile. "This time, I'm ready for anything." Sarah chuckled, setting her mug down on the side table. "That's what you said last time, and look how that turned out." He laughed, shaking his head. "True. But let's just say I've learned my lesson. Besides, even if something does go wrong this time, I know I can handle it. Isn't that what you've been telling me all along?" She nodded approvingly, crossing her arms. "Exactly. It's not about avoiding problems, it's about being prepared to face them. And judging by the way you've handled things lately, I'd say you're more than ready." As they finished packing, David found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired over the past month. From the chaos of forgetting his suitcase to the unexpected wisdom of strangers, from delivering a flawless presentation without his materials to climbing 10 flights of stairs in the dark, each moment had taught him something invaluable. He realized now that losing something, whether it was a physical object or a sense of control, had forced him to confront his fears and discover strengths he didn't know he possessed. The car honked softly outside, signaling the arrival of their taxi. David zipped up his suitcase and grabbed his briefcase, glancing around the room one last time to make sure nothing was left behind. "You know," he said thoughtfully as they walked toward the door, "this whole experience has made me see things differently. Sometimes, losing something teaches us more than having everything ever could." Sarah stopped mid-step, turning to look at him with a proud smile. "That's beautiful, David. And so true. Life is full of surprises, good and bad, but it's how we respond to them that defines us." He nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude, for her unwavering support, for the journey they'd shared, and for the growth he'd experienced along the way. Together, they stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against their faces as they loaded the suitcase into the trunk of the taxi. As they drove toward the airport, Sarah reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "Whatever happens this trip, just remember, you don't need a suitcase to carry strength, resilience, or love. Those are things you already have." David smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "Thanks, Sarah. For everything." When they arrived at O'Hare International Airport, David felt none of the anxiety that had plagued him during his previous departure. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, a knowing that no matter what lay ahead, he was equipped to handle it. As he kissed Sarah goodbye and headed towards security, he glanced back once, catching her warm gaze. This time, he wasn't just traveling with a suitcase. He was carrying the lessons of a lifetime, the understanding that adaptability was strength, imperfection was beauty, and connection was everything. And as the plane soared into the sky, David leaned back in his seat, gazing out at the endless horizon. Whatever challenges awaited him, he knew one thing for certain: he was ready. At its heart, this story is about more than just a forgotten suitcase or a chaotic trip. It's about the power of adaptability, resilience, and perspective. David's journey reminds us that life rarely goes according to plan, but it's in those unexpected moments that we often discover our true strength. Losing something, whether it's material, like a suitcase, or intangible, like control, can feel overwhelming at first. But what if those losses are actually opportunities in disguise? What if they're nudging us to grow, to trust ourselves, and to find beauty in imperfection? David learned that sometimes, having everything isn't the key to success, it's being ready to face whatever comes your way with courage and grace. He discovered that challenges aren't obstacles to fear, they're stepping stones to becoming a better version of yourself. And most importantly, he realized that connection, with loved ones, with strangers, with life itself, is what truly carries us through the toughest times. So, what can we take away from this story? Life will always throw curveballs, but it's not the setbacks that define us, it's how we respond to them. Every inconvenience, every misstep, every moment of chaos holds the potential to teach us something valuable. The question is, are you willing to embrace the mess, learn from it, and keep moving forward? If this story resonated with you, if it made you laugh, reflect, or see your own life in a new light, we'd love for you to join us on this journey of storytelling. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode, because there's always another inspiring tale waiting to be told. Whether it's a lesson in love, resilience, or self-discovery, these stories are crafted to remind you of the incredible strength within you, and the beauty in life's unpredictability. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where losing something, or being unprepared, taught you a valuable lesson? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about the moments that shape us. Your story might just inspire someone else to keep going when the road gets tough. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, remember, life is unpredictable, but that's what makes it beautiful. Keep adapting, keep learning, and keep thriving.